Chapter 5, Deuteronomy. Moses begins by reminding the Israelites of their journey from Egypt to Mount Sinai and then to the wilderness. He recalls the appointment of leaders and the sending of 12 spies to scout the promised land. The Israelites' fear of the inhabitants of Canaan led to their rebellion, and God decreed that the current generation would not enter the land. Moses recounts the Israelites' travels through Edom, Moab, and Ammon, where they were forbidden to take the land. He mentions their victories over the kings of Sihon and Og, and the instructions God gave them to avoid conflict with these nations. Moses talks about the defeat of King Og of Bashan, one of the last of the giants. The land east of the Jordan River is divided among the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh. Moses encourages Joshua, who will lead the Israelites into the Promised Land. Moses urges the Israelites to obey God's commands and remember the covenant. He warns them against idolatry and reminds them of the experience at Mount Sinai when they received the law. He emphasizes that God is unique and deserves complete devotion. Chapter 5. The Ten Commandments Revisited. Moses reiterates the Ten Commandments to the Israelites. He reminds them of their covenant with God and the importance of loving and obeying God. The people are reminded that God spoke to them from the mountain and they are to keep his commands. Moses teaches the Shema, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one," and stresses the importance of loving God with all their heart, soul, and strength. He also emphasizes the need to teach these commands to future generations. The Israelites are warned not to forget God when they prosper in the Promised Land. Chapter 7. The Israelites, Holiness and Separation from Other Nations. Moses instructs the Israelites to destroy the Canaanite nations in the land, not to intermarry with them, and to remain separate in order to preserve their holiness. He reassures them that God will bless them if they are faithful to him and keep his commandments. Chapter 8. Remembering God's provision. Moses reminds the Israelites to remember how God provided for them in the wilderness, including manna and water, and how he disciplined them. He warns them not to become prideful when they enter the Promised Land, but to acknowledge that it is God who gives them success. Moses recalls the Israelites' disobedience, particularly the golden calf incident, and how God's anger was turned away by Moses' intercession. He stresses that it was not their righteousness, but God's mercy that allowed them to survive and continue their journey. Moses recounts how he received the second set of stone tablets after the Israelites' sin with the golden calf. He urges the people to fear and love God and to obey his commands. The chapter also emphasizes the importance of justice and the care for the foreigner, widow, and orphan. Moses encourages the Israelites to love and serve God with all their hearts. He reminds them of the blessings that will come with obedience and the curses that will follow disobedience. He calls them to choose life by obeying God's commands, which will lead to prosperity in the land. Moses instructs the Israelites to destroy all places of idol worship in the land they are about to possess. The worship of God is to be centralized in the place he chooses, later identified as Jerusalem. They are to bring their offerings to this place and avoid the practices of the Canaanites. Chapter 13. Warnings against false prophets and idolatry. Moses warns the Israelites against being led astray by false prophets, even if they perform signs and wonders. Anyone who encourages idolatry is to be put to death. He also gives instructions for dealing with towns that fall into idolatry, calling for the destruction of such towns and their inhabitants. Moses reiterates dietary laws, including which animals are clean and unclean. He also gives instructions on the tithe, the importance of taking care of the Levites and the needy. The Israelites are to be generous with their resources. Chapter 15. The Year of Release and Charity. Every seventh year is the year of release, when debts are forgiven. Moses also urges the Israelites to be generous toward the poor and to give freely to those in need. If a fellow Israelite is in need, they are to help him without being tight-fisted. Chapter 16. The Feasts of the Lord. Moses outlines the three major festivals: Passover, unleavened bread, the Feast of Weeks, Pentecost, and the Feast of Tabernacles. These are times for gathering before God, offering sacrifices, and rejoicing in his blessings. Moses instructs the Israelites on how to handle cases of injustice, idolatry, and false worship. He provides laws for appointing a king, should they desire one in the future. The king is to be chosen by God, must not accumulate too much wealth or power, and must remain humble and obedient to the law. Moses explains the role of the priests and Levites, who are to be supported by the people. He also speaks of the coming prophet, like Moses, who will speak God's words to the people. The people are warned against practicing divination, witchcraft, and other occult practices. Moses establishes cities of refuge where someone who has unintentionally killed another person can flee to avoid revenge. The cities of refuge are to be places of safety until a trial can be held. He also gives laws to ensure justice in cases of murder and other crimes. Moses gives rules for warfare. If the Israelites are about to go to battle, the priests are to encourage them, and they are to offer peace to cities they come across before attacking. If a city refuses peace, it is to be besieged and destroyed. Special provisions are made for dealing with trees and non-combatants in times of war. Various laws are given concerning unsolved murders, the treatment of rebellious children, marriage, and inheritance. A man who is hanged for a crime must not remain hanging overnight, and other details about justice and fairness are outlined. Moses gives laws about property rights, including returning lost property, restitution for theft, and ensuring fairness in all business transactions. There are also laws about maintaining a just and moral community, including prohibitions against various immoral acts. Chapter 23. Exclusion from the assembly and laws of purity. Certain people, such as those with physical defects, eunuchs, or those from certain nations, are excluded from the assembly of the Lord. Laws are also given concerning sexual purity, cleanliness, and the treatment of servants, ensuring the Israelites remain holy and just. Moses gives laws about divorce, the treatment of newlyweds, and the protection of the poor and vulnerable, including laws about lending and collecting debts. He also gives instructions for helping the poor and ensuring fairness in the justice system. Various laws are given about ensuring fairness in justice, including the prohibition of dishonest scales, the requirement to help someone who is being oppressed, and laws about the treatment of workers and the needy. It also includes the command to destroy the Amalekites for their cruelty to Israel. Moses instructs the Israelites to bring the first fruits of their harvest as an offering to God, acknowledging His provision. This is part of a larger commitment to give thanks and remember God's faithfulness. The Israelites are to declare their gratitude for God's deliverance from Egypt. Moses instructs the Israelites to renew the covenant with God. They are to set up stones and inscribe the law on them. The Levites pronounce blessings for obedience and curses for disobedience. The curses are associated with breaking God's commandments, and the people are warned of the consequences of sin. Moses outlines the blessings that will come upon Israel if they obey God's commands: prosperity, victory, and peace, and the curses that will follow if they disobey: disease, defeat, and exile. The chapter emphasizes the importance of covenant faithfulness. Moses renews the covenant with the Israelites and reminds them of God's faithfulness. He calls them to obey God and be faithful to the covenant, urging them to be careful not to turn to idolatry and to keep their hearts true to God. Moses urges the Israelites to choose life by loving God and obeying His commands. He sets before them a choice between life and death, blessings and curses. He calls them to make a deliberate decision to follow God and live in His ways. Moses appoints Joshua as his successor and encourages him to be strong and courageous. Moses writes down the law and instructs the priests to read it aloud to the people every 7 years. He also predicts that the people will eventually turn away from God. Chapter 32. The Song of Moses. Moses recites a song that recounts God's faithfulness, the people's rebellion, and the consequences of their disobedience. The song is a testimony to Israel's history and serves as a reminder of God's greatness and justice. Moses blesses each of the 12 tribes of Israel, offering specific blessings to each tribe. These blessings focus on the tribe's future and role in God's plan, emphasizing God's protection and provision. Moses views the promised land from Mount Nebo, but God tells him that he will not enter it. Moses dies there and is buried by God in an undisclosed location. Joshua succeeds Moses as leader of Israel. The people mourn for Moses, and the book ends with a note on his unique leadership and the greatness of his legacy. The book of Deuteronomy serves as Moses' farewell address to the Israelites, reinforcing the covenant, the laws, and the importance of faithfulness to God as they prepare to enter the Promised Land. It emphasizes obedience to God's commands and the need to remember his deeds in their chapter 6 Joshua. God commissions Joshua to lead Israel after Moses' death. Joshua is told to be strong and courageous, to obey God's law, and to lead the people across the Jordan River into the Promised Land. The people promised to follow Joshua as they did Moses. Chapter 2. The spies and Rahab. Joshua sends 2 spies to Jericho. They are hidden by Rahab, a prostitute, who helps them escape from the king's men. In return, she and her family are promised safety when the Israelites conquer Jericho. Rahab acknowledges the power of Israel's God. God instructs Joshua to have the Israelites cross the Jordan River. The priests carry the Ark of the Covenant into the river, and as soon as their feet touch the water, the river stops flowing, allowing the people to cross on dry ground. 12 men are chosen to take stones from the riverbed as a memorial. Chapter 4. Memorial Stones. The 12 men who took stones from the Jordan set them up at Gilgal as a memorial to mark the miraculous crossing. Joshua also sets up 12 stones in the riverbed where the priests stood. The people camp at Gilgal, and Joshua establishes the first Passover in the land. The Israelites are circumcised at Gilgal as a sign of the covenant, as the previous generation had not been circumcised in the wilderness. The manna stops, and they begin eating the produce of the land. Joshua encounters a mysterious figure, the commander of the Lord's army, who instructs him to take off his sandals as the place is holy. God gives Joshua specific instructions to capture Jericho. The Israelites march around the city once a day for 6 days, and on the 7th day they march around 7 times. The priests blow trumpets and the walls of Jericho fall. The city is destroyed, but Rahab and her family are spared. A curse is pronounced on anyone who rebuilds Jericho. Chapter 7. The Sin of Achan. After the victory at Jericho, Israel is defeated at Ai due to the sin of Achan, who took forbidden spoils from Jericho. Joshua seeks God's guidance, and Achan confesses his sin. He and his family are punished, and the Israelites purify themselves before proceeding. With the sin dealt with, Joshua leads the Israelites in a successful attack on Ai. A strategy involving an ambush is employed. The king of Ai is captured and executed. The Israelites renew the covenant with God by reading the law aloud at Mount Ebal. Chapter 9. The Gibeonite Deception. The Gibeonites deceive Joshua by pretending to be from a distant land. They make a peace treaty with Israel. When the truth comes out, Joshua honors the treaty, but makes the Gibeonites woodcutters and water carriers for the congregation. 5 Amorite kings unite against Gibeon after it makes a treaty with Israel. Joshua comes to their aid and defeats the kings in a miraculous battle. God causes the sun to stand still so the Israelites can complete their victory. The 5 kings are captured and executed. Chapter 11. The Conquest of Northern Canaan. Joshua leads Israel in a series of battles against the northern kings, including King Jabin of Hazor. The northern coalition is defeated, and Hazor is destroyed. Joshua takes the land as God commanded, and the Israelites wipe out many of the Canaanite cities, though some remain. A summary is given of the kings defeated by Moses and Joshua. This includes both the kings of the lands east of the Jordan. These lands were given to Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh. It also includes the kings of Canaan that Joshua defeated. This chapter highlights the success of the Israelites' military campaign. Chapter 13. Division of the land east of the Jordan. Joshua is now old, and God instructs him to divide the remaining land among the tribes. The land east of the Jordan, already conquered, is assigned to the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh. The Levites are not given land, but are supported by the other tribes. Caleb, one of the 2 faithful spies from the wilderness, the other being Joshua, asks for the land promised to him as his inheritance. At 85 years old, he is still strong and ready to fight for the land of Hebron, which is granted to him. The chapter ends with the description of the inheritance of Judah. Chapter 15. The inheritance of Judah. The territory allotted to the tribe of Judah is described, including its cities. Caleb's portion, including Hebron, is also mentioned. The chapter also lists the cities within the territory of Judah, many of which are near the southern border of Canaan. Chapter 16. The inheritance of Ephraim. The territory of the tribe of Ephraim is outlined. It includes many cities, though the Canaanites still live in some areas, and Ephraim struggles to fully drive them out. The tribe's land is adjacent to the land of Manasseh. Chapter 17. The inheritance of Manasseh. The tribe of Manasseh, the largest tribe, receives its inheritance, which is divided between the eastern and western halves of the tribe. The chapter includes details of the land allotted and the struggles of the Manassites to possess their land fully, particularly due to the presence of Canaanites. The tabernacle is set up at Shiloh, and the remaining land is to be divided among the 7 tribes that have not yet received their inheritance. Joshua sends men to survey the land, and the remaining territory is divided by lot. Benjamin's land is allotted first. Chapter 19. The remaining allotments. The land is further divided among the remaining tribes. The chapter details the inheritances of Simeon, Zebulun, Issachar, Asher, Naphtali, Dan, and the return of Joshua's personal inheritance in Timnath-Serah. 6 cities of refuge are established for anyone who kills someone accidentally. These cities allow the person to flee and receive a fair trial instead of being avenged by the victim's family. The cities are scattered across the land, 3 on each side of the Jordan River. Chapter 21. Levitical cities. 48 cities are designated as Levitical cities where the priests and Levites will live. These cities are spread throughout the territories of the other tribes, ensuring that the Levites have access to land and can perform their duties in the service of God. Chapter 22. The altar at Gilgal. The eastern tribes, Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh, returned to their land after helping the other tribes conquer Canaan. On their way, they build an altar at the Jordan River, which causes concern among the western tribes. The matter is resolved when the eastern tribes explain that the altar is not for sacrifices, but as a witness to their connection with the rest of Israel. Joshua, now old, gathers the leaders of Israel for a final speech. He reminds them of God's faithfulness and urges them to remain faithful and obedient. He warns against intermarrying with the Canaanites and turning to idolatry. He affirms that God will drive out the remaining nations if Israel stays faithful. Joshua assembles the Israelites at Shechem for a covenant renewal ceremony. He recounts Israel's history, from Abraham to their time in Egypt and the wilderness, and urges them to choose whom they will serve. The people promise to serve God, and Joshua sets up a stone as a witness to the covenant. Joshua dies at 110 years old, and the book ends with the burial of Joseph's bones in the land of his inheritance. The book of Joshua describes the Israelites' conquest and settlement in Canaan under Joshua's leadership. It covers their military victories, the division of the land among the tribes, the establishment of cities of refuge, and the renewal of the covenant. The book concludes with Joshua's final exhortations to the people to remain faithful to God. Judges chapter 1, Israel's conquest of Canaan. After Joshua's death, the Israelites seek God's guidance on who should lead them in battle against the remaining Canaanites. Judah and Simeon lead successful campaigns, but many Canaanite cities remain unconquered. The chapter also details the failure of other tribes to fully drive out the Canaanites from certain areas. Chapter 2, the angel's rebuke and Israel's apostasy. An angel of the Lord rebukes Israel for not fully obeying God's command to destroy the Canaanites. Israel's disobedience leads to cycles of sin. After Joshua's death, the new generation turns to idolatry, and God allows them to be oppressed by surrounding nations. The Lord raises up judges to deliver them, but the cycle of sin, oppression, repentance, and deliverance continues. Chapter 3, Othniel, Ehud, and Shamgar. God raises up Othniel, the first judge, to deliver Israel from the king of Aram. After Othniel's death, the Israelites turn back to idolatry, and God allows them to be oppressed by Eglon, the Moabite king. Ehud, a left-handed judge, assassinates Eglon and leads Israel to victory over the Moabites. Shamgar also delivers Israel by striking down 600 Philistines with an ox goad. Deborah, a prophetess and judge, leads Israel during a time of oppression by the Canaanite king Jabin and his general Sisera. Deborah summons Barak to lead an army, but he insists that she accompany him. They defeat Sisera, and the victory is credited to God. Sisera flees but is killed by Jael, a woman who drives a tent peg through his skull. The chapter concludes with the Israelites' peace for 40 years. Deborah and Barak sing a victory song praising God for their deliverance from Jabin and Sisera. The song recounts the faithfulness of Israel's leaders and the bravery of Jael. It also calls for praise for the victory and condemns the tribes that did not participate in the battle. The Israelites are oppressed by the Midianites, who devastate the land. God calls Gideon, a fearful farmer, to deliver Israel. Gideon questions God and asks for signs to confirm his calling, including the famous fleece test where God makes the fleece wet and then dry. God reassures Gideon and prepares him for battle. Gideon, with only 300 men, defeats the vast Midianite army through a surprise night attack, following God's specific instructions. The Midianites are confused and turn on each other. Gideon's victory is a clear demonstration of God's power. Afterward, the Israelites want to make Gideon their king, but he refuses, stating that only God should rule over them. After the victory, Gideon pursues the remaining Midianites and defeats them. He makes a golden ephod from the spoils of war, but it becomes an object of idolatry. The Israelites continue to sin after Gideon's death, and they turn to Baal worship. Gideon's son Abimelech attempts to become king, but his reign is marked by violence and division. Chapter 9. Abimelech's reign and death. Abimelech, son of Gideon by a concubine, kills his 70 brothers to secure his claim to the throne. However, his rule is unstable, and he faces rebellion. A woman throws a millstone on Abimelech's head, and he dies, fulfilling a curse pronounced by Jotham, the only surviving son of Gideon. Abimelech's death marks the end of his tyrannical reign. Chapter 10. Tola and Jair. After Abimelech's death, two minor judges, Tola and Jair, arise to lead Israel. Tola judges Israel for 23 years and Jair for 22 years. Both bring a period of peace, but Israel continues to sin by turning to idolatry. God allows the Ammonites to oppress Israel as a consequence. Jephthah, an outcast, is chosen by the elders to lead Israel against the Ammonites. He makes a rash vow to sacrifice whatever comes out of his house if he is victorious. After defeating the Ammonites, Jephthah returns home and, tragically, sacrifices his daughter, fulfilling his vow. His victory brings peace for 6 years. Chapter 12. The conflict between Jephthah and Ephraim. Jephthah's victory over the Ammonites is followed by a conflict with the tribe of Ephraim, who accuses him of not involving them in the battle. Jephthah defends his actions, and a battle ensues. Jephthah's forces defeat Ephraim, and 42,000 Ephraimites are killed. Jephthah judges Israel for 6 years before his death. Chapter 13. The birth of Samson. The Israelites are oppressed by the Philistines. An angel visits Manoah and his wife, announcing that they will have a son who will deliver Israel from the Philistines. The child Samson is dedicated to God as a Nazirite. His birth is a sign of God's plan for Israel's deliverance. Samson grows up and chooses a Philistine woman to marry. During his wedding feast, he poses a riddle to the Philistines, which they cannot solve. After being betrayed by his wife, Samson kills 30 Philistines to settle the bet. His relationship with his wife deteriorates and he returns to his parents. Samson returns to his wife, but her father has given her to another man. In anger, Samson catches 300 foxes, ties their tails together with torches, and sets them loose in the Philistine fields. The Philistines retaliate by burning his wife and father-in-law. Samson attacks the Philistines in revenge, killing many of them. He judges Israel for 20 years. Chapter 16. Samson and Delilah. Samson falls in love with Delilah, a Philistine woman. The Philistines bribe her to discover the secret of Samson's strength. After several attempts, Delilah persuades Samson to reveal that his strength comes from his Nazirite vow, particularly his uncut hair. Delilah betrays him and Samson is captured, blinded, and imprisoned. However, his hair begins to grow back, and he is brought to a Philistine temple. Samson prays to God for strength, and with one final act, he pulls down the temple pillars, killing himself and thousands of Philistines. A man named Micah creates a private shrine with idols and appoints his own priest. He hires a Levite to be his personal priest, which reflects the moral decline in Israel at the time. This chapter sets the stage for further idolatry and corruption in Israel. Chapter 18. The Danites seek inheritance. The tribe of Dan, unable to conquer their territory, sends spies to find a new home. They discover the city of Laish, which is peaceful and prosperous. The Danites attack, destroy the city, and rename it Dan. They also take Micah's idols and his priest, further deepening the idolatry in Israel. A Levite and his concubine are traveling when they stop in the town of Gibeah in the territory of Benjamin. The men of the town abuse the concubine and she dies as a result. The Levite dismembers her body and sends the parts to the 12 tribes, inciting outrage. The Israelites gather to avenge the crime committed in Gibeah. A civil war breaks out against the tribe of Benjamin, which refuses to hand over the perpetrators. After several battles, the Israelites defeat Benjamin, killing most of its men. The tribe of Benjamin is nearly wiped out. To prevent the extinction of the tribe of Benjamin, the Israelites find wives for the remaining Benjamite men by allowing them to abduct women from the town of Shiloh. The chapter ends with a reminder of the chaotic state of Israel, where everyone did what was right in their own eyes. The book of Judges describes a turbulent period in Israel's history, marked by cycles of sin, oppression, repentance, and deliverance. The book highlights the failure of Israel's leaders to maintain faithfulness to God and the challenges of moral decay and idolatry. Despite these struggles, God raises up judges to deliver his people, but the cycle continues until the establishment of the monarchy. Ruth, the story begins with a famine in Bethlehem. Elimelech and his family, including his wife Naomi and 2 sons, move to Moab. Over time, Elimelech dies, and the 2 sons marry Moabite women, Orpah and Ruth. After 10 years, both sons die, leaving Naomi and her 2 daughters-in-law widowed. Naomi decides to return to Bethlehem because she hears that the famine there has ended. She urges Orpah and Ruth to return to their families, but Ruth refuses, pledging her loyalty to Naomi. Ruth famously says, "Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay." The 2 women return to Bethlehem, and Naomi is greeted with surprise by the people. In Bethlehem, to provide for Naomi and herself, Ruth goes to glean in the fields. She happens to glean in the field of Boaz, a wealthy relative of Naomi's late husband. Boaz notices Ruth and shows kindness, ensuring that she is well protected and given extra grain. Ruth reports back to Naomi about Boaz's kindness, and Naomi realizes that Boaz is a relative who could be a kinsman redeemer. Naomi encourages Ruth to continue gleaning in Boaz's field. Naomi devises a plan for Ruth to approach Boaz and request his protection as a kinsman redeemer. Ruth is instructed to visit Boaz at the threshing floor after he has finished eating and drinking. When Boaz falls asleep, Ruth uncovers his feet and lies down at his feet, a gesture of submission and asking for his protection. Boaz is startled, and Ruth asks him to spread his cloak over her, symbolizing his willingness to redeem her. Boaz is impressed by Ruth's kindness and commitment, noting that she could have chosen a younger man but chose him. He agrees to take on the responsibility, but he mentions that there is a closer relative who has the first right to redeem her. Boaz goes to the city gate to meet the closer relative, who initially agrees to redeem Ruth's property but refuses to marry her because it would endanger his own inheritance. Boaz then declares that he will redeem Ruth, and the relative relinquishes his right. Boaz publicly declares his intent to marry Ruth and redeems her. The people of the town bless the union, praying that Ruth's descendants may be as renowned as those of Rachel and Leah, the matriarchs of Israel. Ruth and Boaz marry, and they have a son, Obed. Naomi, who had been mourning her losses, is filled with joy and takes the child into her care. The book ends with a genealogy. Obed becomes the father of Jesse, and Jesse becomes the father of David, placing Ruth and Boaz in the lineage of King David. The book of Ruth is a story of loyalty, kindness, and redemption. It highlights the importance of familial responsibility, faithfulness, and God's providence. Ruth, a foreigner, becomes part of the lineage of David and, ultimately, the lineage of Jesus Christ. The narrative also showcases the significance of community and the role of women in God's plan. 1 Samuel chapter 1. The birth of Samuel. Elkanah and his wife Hannah are childless. Hannah prays fervently for a son, promising to dedicate him to the Lord's service. God answers her prayer, and she gives birth to Samuel. After Samuel is weaned, she fulfills her vow and brings him to the tabernacle at Shiloh to serve under the priest Eli. Chapter 2. The wicked sons of Eli. Samuel grows up serving God, and Eli the priest blesses him. However, Eli's sons Hophni and Phinehas are corrupt and dishonor God by taking the best parts of the sacrifices and committing immorality. A prophet rebukes Eli's family, predicting the downfall of his house. Meanwhile, Samuel continues to grow in favor with God and the people. Chapter 3. God calls Samuel. Samuel, still a young boy, hears God's voice calling him during the night. At first, he thinks it's Eli, but Eli realizes it's God speaking. Eli instructs Samuel to respond. God reveals to Samuel that he will judge Eli's family for their wickedness. Samuel grows up to be a recognized prophet. Israel goes to battle against the Philistines and suffers a great defeat. The Ark of the Covenant is captured by the Philistines, and Eli's sons are killed. When Eli hears the news, he falls dead, and his daughter-in-law, pregnant with Phinehas's child, dies in childbirth. The child is named Ichabod, meaning the glory has departed, symbolizing God's departure from Israel. The Philistines place the ark in the temple of their god Dagon. The statue of Dagon falls before the ark, and the people of Philistine cities suffer from tumors and disease. The Philistines decide to return the ark to Israel, fearing its power. Chapter 6. The ark returned to Israel. The Philistines return the ark along with a guilt offering to the Israelites. The ark is placed in a field in Beth Shemesh. However, some Israelites look inside the ark, which leads to their deaths. The ark is then moved to Kiriath Jearim, where it stays for many years. Chapter 7. Samuel leads Israel. Samuel calls the Israelites to repent from idolatry and return to God. They gather at Mizpah, and Samuel leads them in prayer and sacrifice. The Philistines, seeing the Israelites united, attack. However, God intervenes with thunder, causing confusion among the Philistines, who are defeated. Samuel sets up a stone as a memorial to God's help. Chapter 8. Israel demands a king. As Samuel grows old, his sons, who are appointed as judges, are corrupt. The people ask Samuel to appoint a king to rule over them, like other nations. Samuel is displeased, but God tells him to grant their request, warning that a king will take their resources and sons for service in his army. Saul, a tall and handsome man from the tribe of Benjamin, is chosen by God to be Israel's first king. Saul meets Samuel while searching for his father's lost donkeys. Samuel anoints Saul in private and tells him that God has chosen him to lead Israel. Chapter 10. Saul is publicly anointed king. Samuel publicly declares Saul as king and gives him signs to confirm God's choice. Saul is anointed with oil, and the people accept him as their king. However, some people are skeptical, and a few refuse to acknowledge him as king. Saul returns home and keeps the matter quiet, waiting for the right moment. The Ammonites threaten the city of Jabesh Gilead, and the people ask Saul for help. Saul rallies Israel's forces and defeats the Ammonites, securing his position as king. The people affirm Saul as king at Gilgal, and they celebrate the victory. Chapter 12. Samuel's farewell address. Samuel, now old, delivers a farewell speech to Israel, reminding them of God's faithfulness and their rejection of him by asking for a king. Samuel urges the people to serve God faithfully and promises that he will continue to pray for them. He also warns them of the consequences of disobedience. God sends thunder and rain as a sign of his displeasure when the people repent. Saul, in his early reign, is confronted with a crisis when the Philistines gather to fight Israel. Saul waits for Samuel to offer sacrifices, but when Samuel delays, Saul takes matters into his own hands and performs the sacrifice himself, violating God's command. Samuel rebukes Saul and tells him that his kingdom will not endure because of his disobedience. Jonathan, Saul's son, leads a successful raid against the Philistines, but Saul makes a rash vow that no one should eat until the evening. Jonathan, unaware of the vow, eats honey and is later rebuked by Saul. The people intervene to prevent Jonathan's death. Saul continues to fight the Philistines, but is unsuccessful in completely defeating them. God commands Saul to completely destroy the Amalekites and their possessions. However, Saul spares King Agag and the best of the livestock. Samuel confronts Saul, rebuking him for his disobedience. God rejects Saul as king, and Samuel tells Saul that his kingdom will be given to another. Samuel also kills Agag, and Saul and Samuel part ways. God directs Samuel to anoint David, the youngest son of Jesse, as the future king of Israel. Samuel visits Jesse's family in Bethlehem, and David is chosen after the other sons are rejected. The Spirit of the Lord comes upon David, and he begins to play the harp for King Saul, who is troubled by an evil spirit. The Philistines and Israelites face off in battle, and the giant Goliath challenges Israel's army daily. David, a shepherd boy, volunteers to fight Goliath, trusting in God's help. He defeats Goliath with a sling and a stone, and the Israelites rout the Philistines. David becomes a national hero. Saul becomes jealous of David's success and popularity, especially after the women of Israel sing that David has slain tens of thousands. Saul fears David as a rival and attempts to kill him. However, David continues to serve faithfully, and his friendship with Saul's son, Jonathan, grows stronger. Saul repeatedly tries to kill David, but David is warned by Jonathan and Saul's servants. David flees to Naioth in Ramah, where Samuel helps him. Saul sends men to capture David, but they are overcome by the Spirit of God and prophesy instead. Saul eventually goes himself, but is also overcome by the Spirit. David flees from Saul and seeks refuge with Jonathan, asking him to find out Saul's true intentions. Jonathan confirms that Saul wants to kill David, and they make a covenant of friendship and loyalty. David must flee, and Jonathan secretly signals to him that it is no longer safe to return. David flees to the town of Nob, where the priest Ahimelech gives him food and Goliath's sword. Saul finds out about this and orders the massacre of the priests at Nob. David then flees to Gath, the Philistine city, where he pretends to be insane to avoid being captured. David gathers a group of 400 men who become his loyal followers. Meanwhile, Saul orders the execution of Ahimelech and the priests of Nob, despite their innocence. Only Abiathar, one of the priests, escapes and joins David. David rescues the city of Keilah from the Philistines, but is pursued by Saul. David consults God through the ephod and learns that Saul will attack. David flees into the wilderness, where he continues to evade Saul's attempts to capture him. Saul pursues David into the wilderness of En-Gedi. David has an opportunity to kill Saul in a cave but chooses not to, sparing Saul's life. He secretly cuts off a corner of Saul's robe to show that he meant no harm. Saul is moved by David's mercy and acknowledges that David will one day be king. Samuel dies and Israel mourns. David, while in the wilderness, is confronted by Nabal, a wealthy but foolish man. Nabal refuses to help David, and his wife, Abigail, intervenes by bringing food to David and asking for mercy. David praises Abigail for her wisdom, and Nabal dies shortly afterward. David marries Abigail. Saul once again pursues David, but David has another opportunity to kill him in his camp. David takes Saul's spear and water jug but does not harm him. He calls out to Saul, showing that he could have killed him, but chose not to. David, fearing Saul's pursuit, flees to the Philistine city of Gath and becomes a mercenary for King Achish. David deceives Achish by raiding Philistine towns while pretending to attack Israelite territories. As Saul faces the Philistine army, he consults God but receives no answer. In desperation, he visits the medium at Endor, where the spirit of the deceased Samuel is brought up. Samuel prophesies that Saul and his sons will die in battle the next day. The Philistine lords, fearing David might turn against them in battle, refuse to let him join their army against Israel. David returns to Ziklag, while the Philistines march toward Israel. The Amalekites raid David's city of Ziklag while he is away. David pursues them, rescues his wives and the people of Ziklag, and recovers all the plunder. He shares the spoils with his men and with others in Israel, establishing a custom of generosity. Saul's army is defeated by the Philistines. Saul is critically wounded and, unable to survive, falls on his own sword. His sons, including Jonathan, are killed in battle. The Philistines desecrate Saul's body, but the men of Jabesh-Gilead recover it and give it a proper burial. The book ends with the tragic death of Israel's first king. The book of 1 Samuel describes the transition from the period of the judges to the monarchy in Israel. It highlights the rise and fall of King Saul, the anointing of David as his successor, and the ongoing conflict between Saul and David. The book emphasizes themes of obedience to God, leadership, and God's providence in guiding Israel through difficult times. 2 Samuel chapter 1, David hears of Saul's death. David learns of Saul and Jonathan's deaths from an Amalekite man who claims to have killed Saul. David mourns and laments their deaths, especially the loss of Jonathan, his close friend. Chapter 2, David anointed king over Judah. David is anointed king of Judah at Hebron, while Saul's son Ishbosheth becomes king of Israel. Tensions rise, and there is a series of battles between the forces of David, Judah, and those loyal to Ishbosheth. Chapter 3, Abner joins David. Abner, the commander of Saul's army, defects to David's side after a falling out with Ishbosheth. David agrees to terms but is later angered when Joab kills Abner in revenge for the death of his brother. Abner's death causes political turmoil, but David publicly mourns. Chapter 4. The murder of Ishbosheth. Two of Ishbosheth's captains murder him and bring his head to David, thinking he will reward them. David condemns their actions and has them executed. Chapter 5. David becomes king over all Israel. David is anointed king over all of Israel after years of division. He captures Jerusalem from the Jebusites, making it his capital, and expands his territory. David's kingdom begins to solidify. Chapter 6. The Ark of the Covenant brought to Jerusalem. David brings the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem with great celebration. However, Uzzah is struck dead by God when he touches the ark, which frightens David. He eventually brings the ark into Jerusalem with great reverence. Chapter 7. God's Covenant with David. David expresses a desire to build a temple for God, but God, through the prophet Nathan, tells him his son will build it. God makes a covenant with David, promising that his descendants will rule Israel forever. Chapter 8. David's military victories. David defeats multiple enemies, including the Philistines, Moabites, and Arameans, expanding Israel's borders and securing peace. He establishes a strong kingdom. Chapter 9. David's kindness to Mephibosheth. David seeks out any surviving members of Saul's family to show kindness to for Jonathan's sake. He finds Mephibosheth, Jonathan's son, who is crippled, and restores his grandfather Saul's land to him. Chapter 10. War with Ammon and Aram. David sends emissaries to the Ammonites to offer condolences after the death of their king, but they insult his messengers. A war breaks out and David's army defeats both the Ammonites and their allies, the Arameans. Chapter 11. David and Bathsheba. David commits adultery with Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah, one of his soldiers. When Bathsheba becomes pregnant, David arranges for Uriah to be killed in battle to cover up the sin. The prophet Nathan rebukes David, who repents, but the child dies as a consequence. Chapter 12. Nathan's parable and David's repentance. Nathan confronts David with a parable of injustice, and David realizes his guilt. He repents and God forgives him, but the child born from his sin dies. Bathsheba later bears Solomon. Chapter 13. Amnon and Tamar. Amnon, David's son, rapes his half-sister Tamar. Her brother Absalom takes revenge by killing Amnon. Absalom flees, and David is deeply distressed but does not take action. Chapter 14. Absalom returns to Jerusalem. Absalom returns to Jerusalem after 3 years of exile, but David hesitates to reconcile with him. Joab arranges for a reunion, and Absalom is allowed to return but is not yet allowed to see the king. Chapter 15. Absalom's revolt. Absalom gains the support of the people and declares himself king in Hebron, starting a rebellion. David flees Jerusalem to escape Absalom's forces, while Absalom takes over the city. Chapter 16. David's flight and Shimei's cursing. As David flees, Shimei, a relative of Saul, curses him. Despite David's men wanting to kill Shimei, David shows restraint, trusting that God may be using this to bring judgment on him. Absalom enters Jerusalem. Chapter 17. Hushai's counsel and Absalom's downfall. Hushai, a friend of David, gives Absalom bad advice, which leads to a delay in attacking David. David's forces regroup, and Absalom's rebellion begins to unravel. Chapter 18. The Battle of Ephraim's Wood. David's forces defeat Absalom's army in a forest. Absalom is caught by his hair in a tree, and Joab kills him. David mourns deeply for his son, even though Absalom had rebelled. Chapter 19. David returns to Jerusalem. After Absalom's death, David returns to Jerusalem. He is reconciled with his people, and tensions are eased with former enemies like Shimei, who had cursed him. Chapter 20. Sheba's revolt. Sheba, a Benjaminite, leads a brief rebellion against David. David's forces track him down, and Sheba is killed. This puts an end to the revolt and restores peace. Chapter 21. Famine, revenge, and Philistine battles. A famine strikes, and David seeks God's guidance. It is revealed that the famine is due to Saul's unjust killing of the Gibeonites. David seeks justice by handing over Saul's descendants for execution. David also defeats the Philistines in several battles. Chapter 22. David's Song of Deliverance. David sings a psalm of thanksgiving for God's deliverance. The song expresses his gratitude for God's protection throughout his life. Chapter 23. David's last words and mighty men. David's final words are recorded, and he praises God as the righteous ruler of Israel. The chapter also lists David's mighty men and their heroic deeds. Chapter 24, the census and plague. David orders a census which displeases God, as it reflects his reliance on human strength rather than trusting in God. As punishment, a plague strikes Israel, killing 70,000 people. David repents and buys a threshing floor from Araunah to build an altar to God. The plague ends after David makes a sacrifice.